All right, good morning, everybody, and welcome to the last day of the St. Louis Pen Show's Pen and Penmanship Expo. It looks like we've got a pretty good group for so early in the morning, so thanks for everybody for joining us. We've got four amazing sessions lined up throughout the day, so don't miss out on any of them because they're going to be pretty awesome. And we're starting with a visit from Joshua Lax from Lax Pen Company, who's going to talk to us about a topic that I am very interested in. I've mangled a few nibs in my day, and I've gotten nibs that kind of weren't so good in pens out of the box. So, really interested in what we're going to hear from Joshua. So, Joshua, welcome, and thanks for joining us. And you should be able to share your screen.
Yeah, all right. Thank you so much. So first of all, good morning, everybody. Again, I'm Joshua Lax. I guess some people call me Nib Meister. I like Nib Maven, just as a little something different. I'm a full-time lawyer, but I do nibs, and I've been trained to do nibs. I have some experience doing nibs. I'm doing projects with companies now, like Esterbrook, for nibs. So yes, thank you, Jason. Good morning to you. So the purpose of today's talk is to deal with something that's very frustrating, especially if you're just starting out in the world of fountain pens. And that is, why is my nib or why is my pen doing what it's doing? Why am I getting a lot of scratchiness? Why is it skipping? What's up with the flow? What's up with the tipping? Something seems wrong. I just can't tell what. What is it going on? So the purpose of this is to try and avoid those hair pulling out moments that might make someone who's just trying a pen, for example, say, you know what, I'm just going to put this away, right? Because there's a solution to a lot of this, right? Sometimes there just isn't. But in my experience, most of the time you can figure something out. And sometimes it's something you're not even going to be like intuiting or like thinking, because it just, without having that prior experience, you may not get it. So I tend to use a lot of photos. So what's going to happen is I'm going to share my screen. I'm going to go through photographs. As Ken asked everybody to put the questions through, I don't know how much folks have experience with Zoom nowadays, but if you could, I'm not going to see raised hands or things like that. And I just ask, do everything in the chat so we don't get into Zoom chaos. So that's what the focus is going to be. I will talk about some of the methods for this, but a couple of things. So first, a warning, which is it's very easy for these things to go wrong because you're dealing with, and this is maybe the first point to take away, you're dealing with a flat piece of metal, but you're dealing with a flat piece of metal that's not like a piece of paper where it's flat. You're dealing with a piece of metal that has been using hydraulic pressure and other things stamped and bended into a like convex semicircle position. And so when you're dealing with bends and things like that, you're not dealing with things going up and down or side to side, let's say. You're dealing with things going in and out at angles. So like that can be a very difficult thing to factor in depending on like the direction things are going. Also on that note, you are dealing with at times you're putting pressure against another object when you're moving the nib back and forth. So it's possible to bend the nib in this. So keep in mind, these things can go south. Also, sometimes it could take a lot longer to employ some of these techniques than you think. And so it doesn't seem like it's getting better. Your hand's getting tired. And all of a sudden you give it like, well, I'm just going to do one final blow and hopefully that gets it all set up. And then the thing snaps on you or something like that. So it's there's patience involved, and I'll talk about some things. You can ask questions about how you would go about fixing things, but I would either contact me side channel for more about methods and means for fixing some of these problems, or try and find someone like in your local pen club or something that can do it, or take one of the like nib smoothing classes that are sometimes offered at shows when they're back in person. That's really the best way for me. Learning this stuff, doing it with someone and then practicing on my own was the best way to learn it. Anyway, those being the sort of warnings I have to give everyone, let's get into the meat of it. So I'm going to address things today from the perspective of scratchiness and flow, because that's usually the two big things, and we'll talk about some other stuff as we go along, but that's really the perspective, right? Because that's normally for most of the users, you're going to find that that's the problem. Why is it scratchy, or why isn't flowing right? um there's what's the hang up. Tipping size and stuff, I think, is a little more obvious, so we'll get to that. But the thing to recognize was sort of in the geometry, right? So again, it's not a flat piece of paper, it's a piece of metal that's been bended into a semicircle or convex shape. And what we're talking about with it is there's physics, and the physics all have to align. So the feed has to be within a certain proximity to the nib, and then the slit of the nib needs to be no wider than a certain amount, which is point, I think, 0.02 millimeters. And if it goes beyond that, you lose capillary action. So to be perfect, everything has to be in a line in the perfect proximity. So if some of you are a lawyer and you remember back to criminal law, and the first thing they told you was to commit a criminal offense, all the elements have to occur at the exact same moment in the exact same place. Nib works the same way. Everything's got to be in the right position for everything to be perfect. And we can talk more about what that means as we go through the morning. So I'm going to attempt to screen share my photo viewer, and we're just going to go through the photos. And again, feel free to ask questions, because again, the whole point of today's presentation is to help everyone figure out what's bothering them so that they don't lose their minds over it. Now, everyone should be able to see a gallery of various photos of nibs. Is that appearing? All right, so I'm going to try and go to the first one and see what happens. Has everyone got that in front of them? All right, great. I see head nodding. Okay. So the first thing I want to talk about is what I'm just going to refer to as hard edges, right? So here we have a sailor nib. I think this is a broad. That is the standard factory broad. So a couple of things to notice. You'll see, and I think I can actually draw on this. Yes, I can. All right. I like drawing on this. It helps me think. So actually, let's see if we go right here. Nope, that did not work. Okay, right. No, sorry. We'll get this right going forward. All right. Okay. So most nibs, and you'll see it as we go through the photos, the area from like the top, which is right here is what I'm talking about, down to here is generally speaking rounded. And why is it rounded? It's rounded so that when you write, every direction you go in, you get the same stroke. That's the whole point of a ball-tipped nib. Sailor does something that's sort of unique in the world of this, and that is even in their standard nibs, as you get larger, it gets more pronounced, but they have this this sort of circular cut into the top corners of the nib, right? So if you look at, say, a Jowo or a Bach nib, this thing is rounded all the way through from the top as I drew to the midpoint. They cut in this this sort of circular angle on both sides of the nib. So if we turned it around, you'd see it's the exact mirror image. Why they do it, I'm not particularly sure. I think it has to do with how the writing they're trying to achieve for the types of characters they're thinking people are going to be writing with. And it's fine. It doesn't always bother people. But what you get is right here, right? Because they're cutting something, and on both sides, you're going to have it. And you should see two pink lines that I'm drawing. You're going to get a hard edge. And so if you're writing with this at a very low angle, right? Meaning that the paper is here where my index finger is, and then you're writing like this, it's going to contact here on the bottom. It's going to be very smooth. But if you're writing at a higher angle, which includes myself, I tend to write at a higher angle, the where you're going to be hitting the paper is like that, is going to be up here, right? Which means you're going to be having these edges scratching on the paper. So from time to time, I get people that want to take that out, and so you basically have to remove enough tipping to reshape this to be much more circular and much less edged out than the manufacturer intended. Nothing wrong with that. It's just something to know. But it's a good example of some of this issue, which is we all buy nibs which have a lot more scratchy edges than I think we think. And I think that for me at least, one part of my learning curve was understanding that even though you don't think you're hitting some of these edges, particularly at the top, and we'll see examples of it in other nibs I have photographs of, you are actually, as you're writing, it is hitting the paper enough to cause scratchiness. So to do a proper job smoothing out a nib, you need for that person, you need to remove all the hard edges for yourself or the person you're doing the work for, that they could possibly hit as their hand is angling up and down and they're writing different words. So that is the edges, and they're there. And I can tell you, like, Pilot extra fines are very pointy. Same with Platinum extra fines, and they have cut into it an edge that's not for everybody, and sometimes needs to be taken out. The When you get cursive italics or stubs made by a Nibmeister, sometimes it feels a little scratchy. Why is that? Because the top of it still has a little bit of a burr that needs to be taken off. Or, and we'll talk more about this, inside the slit itself, needs to be sanded ever so slightly to take out any burrs. And if you think about it, when you're cutting into a piece of metal, you're going to leave in the slit, it's going to be a knife edge, because you're basically cutting 90 degrees into the metal, and so you're leaving, a corner, and that can cause things. So that's a little bit on hard edges. I'm going to move on to the next photo. All right. Next, we have something else. So this is another much discussed issue. I forget what pen this is, but you can see it's fairly broad. And I'm showing you this. Oh, sorry. Let me go back. I'm in someone else's house, and they're looking at me strangely, like, what am I talking about here? So I'm sitting in the house of the uninitiated, being observed. So in any event. Everyone should see this on the screen. Does everyone have a nib kind of facing? All right. So this is the much talked about baby's bottom. Obviously, I could probably rotate it, and it would look like a bottom. But what you can see is the shape of the tipping, right, is almost like it's like almost like the top of a heart, right? Like if you draw a line. And so what that is a couple things. One is the slitting wheel that was used to cut the center of the nib is too thick, and so it takes off too much material when it's going in. Or it's over polished on the inside. So you remember I mentioned, like, if you're gonna have hard edges left in the nib slit, it's easy to give yourself baby's bottom if you go too deep into it, because you're basically working from the middle of that slit on out, and that can give you baby's bottom. I sometimes think it's overdiagnosed. People try to go to this whenever they can, but it does exist, and it does exist particularly, I think, with modern fountain pens, because people are over polishing them, or the slitting wheels are somehow off or something like that. And so what you have to do in that circumstance is you have to basically remove the material, enough material to get it back to kind of like that more 90-degree corner, and then repolish it if you need to, but much less. And that's how you remove baby's bottom. How you do that, actually, I left my fountain pen upstairs, but basically you take an abrasive. So something like this, you would use like 2000 wet dry sandpaper. So again, this is something that you need to try it out, and try and see someone do it if you can. I am, again, out, I'm traveling, so I don't have the full setup, but if you want a video of it, I can film a video and send it to you, or I can give it to Ken and we can make it an after program material. But basically, so you have the nib, right? And so how I learned to do this, and there's different ways, but basically you have the abrasive, you put the nib against the abrasive lightly, you start going back and forth with the pen, and then you start angling it down, just like I'm doing here, and then angling it back up. And what that does is it sands on the round, and then you get that baby's bottom flattens out. Now, what you have to then be worried about whenever you're doing something like that, even if you're working on the round, you have to be worried that you're not going to cause hard edges on the side of it, because now you're taking off material on the front, but it's not being taken off on the end. So then you then have to re-round the edges, or else it's going to be scratchy. So, and I didn't say this at the start, I should have mentioned this. How do you know you might have baby's bottom? It skips, meaning you put the pen to the paper and you start writing, and you get like a little bit of the stroke is missing at the very start. Why is that happening? It's because the capillary action is taking longer to fill than it was than when you start, right? So if it's a perfectly adjusted nib, it comes right away. But it takes ever so slight amount of time for the ink to fill that space when you put it on the paper, and so you're getting the skip. So that's the first indicator that you might have something, right, that's wrong with the flow, wrong with the capillary action. But in fixing it, you then have to be where you're going to creating other problems that have to be rectified, which is a hard edge. And so the way I was trained to do that is you take, again, the same paper and you go around the nib in every direction. You don't want to keep going in one direction, because you're going to wear a hard edge into it as well, and then you'll have to fix that. But you want to keep moving in all different directions, and that should start to take out the edge. The other thing is, when you're doing all this, you should be using a loop. The Bellomo loops are highly recommended. You can find other ones out there. You want a good one though, for your own sake and for the sake of the pen. But you want to keep checking frequently what you're doing, so you don't go too far, or you don't go far enough and you keep getting frustrated or something, and then other problems arise from that. All right, so that is baby's bottom. We might see a little baby's bottom later in the thing, but I would say baby's bottom is way overdiagnosed in the world of nib issues. There are many other things that are likely occurring before you have baby's bottom. So you want to give a holistic check. Obviously, you can see with this, it's somewhat obvious, like how you get that, but there may be other times where it's not so obvious and it is the problem. I've seen Omos a couple times had that. Some nibs I've worked on, I can remember. And you basically follow the same operation, even though it doesn't really look like it, and you get much better results. All right, so let's talk about another issue.
Hey, Joshua, before we go on, can I
Yeah.
interrupt quick? I'm hearing a lot of background noise. Is that coming from your end?
Yeah, it might be someone's washing dishes. Is it like, and you hear it? You know what? I can go in a different room.
No, that's fine.
Yeah.
I just want to make sure if it was someone else, I could mute them, but I couldn't tell if it was coming from anyone else.
Sorry.
No worries.
I thought this would be a good room with the lighting and everything to be in, but I could.
Yeah, no, it's fine.
Right.
But we do have a couple questions. Laura
Sure, yes.
asking, what magnification loop do you use?
So I use a 10x for that, I believe, and I have a spare 20x that I got one time. I never used it. This is all shot with a moment lens, macro lens that's like an attachment to your iPhone. So this is not through the loop, just so everyone knows. But yeah, a 10x loop should be good enough. Okay. And then I wear an optivisor that I think is 5 or 8x. There's a nice optivisor if you don't want to spend a lot of money from Harbor Freight. That's like at least a couple years ago it was $10.99, and it's like a 5x or 10x in the actual like goggle lens, but then it has like a fold down loop that you can put in front of that gives you extra magnification, which is a cheap way to try all this out, even though it's not the best, but like it's definitely usable. And if you're just trying this stuff out and you don't want to spend a lot of money, Harbor Freight might be a place to get some of the stuff, including that. All right. Another thing that affects flow, and everyone should see the reverse side of a nib, right? The underside of the nib is the placement of the feed or the nib on the feed, or where the feed is. So this is pretty obvious, right? You could see that it's completely askew. And you might have flow issues because the ink is not actually getting to the nib slit directly. So you're relying on all sorts of things to happen under there. understand also that the process that's happening in the feed to the nib itself is like air and liquid displacing each other, right? So here's my annotator out here. So what happens is ink is going up this way to the tip, right? And it's actually going from underneath the feed along the feed channel, right? And then air is going back down into your ink storage, right? So there's a displacement. So the liquid is traveling on the feed, the air is traveling in the space between the feed and the nib. And if you were to take this apart, what you'd see is that there's a channel down the middle. And so what's happening is the channel is leaving the ink on the side on the nib, and then it has to travel over to the slit to actually be able to write, which may happen if it's, you know, engorged enough in that space, but might not because of the various physics that are taking place. This obviously is a very obvious example, but I'm going to show you one where it's not going to be that obvious, but I can tell you it's a problem, which is the next. Give me 1 second. My drawer's on. All right. Sorry. Okay. Does that look like an okay, like that should be good to write, right? Like it looks pretty good. If you got it out of the box, like it looks pretty good. But I'm going to tell you, even this little bit of space.
I have it out, but I think.
Sorry? Okay, I don't know if that was for me. Basically, what you can see is that it's a little bit off, but it's so little. And this is where it's properly placed, right? I mean, you can barely see the difference, but I can tell you that as you use this one, it's going to skip on you and be a little wonky compared to this, even though it's like a fraction of a millimeter that it's off, but it still has a difference. And again, because it's the issue of proximity playing out in this in the required physics of the situation. Here's another example of this problem. This is a Visconti that someone's given me to work on. So what you can see here, and actually I don't think the owner is on with us, but if they are, you know, feel free to ask questions. So what it is, I mean, from the folks I can see, which are only 5, can you see where the problem is in about the feed? Yeah, I see people.
Far away.
Yeah, I don't know. I'll just draw it in and we can take it from there. So there is a space right in here that you can see. You can actually see, if you look at the nib, it goes this way, that the nib is bent out of the right position. And so that is leaving a space between the tines and the feed, and this will interrupt the flow almost considerably. And you can kind of see that like there's ink all over the side of the nib here. I think it was from someone trying to figure this out, and like their own finger touching like around is what created capillary action to spread ink all over it. And so that's one of the issues. I believe this is a custom ground nib, although I'm not positive. I believe this is the newer Visconti 14K nib. And I don't know, this might be their stub, I'm not sure. It looks custom ground to me, and I'll just point out like right here where I put this arrow that's sort of horizontal is a hard edge that I would be concerned about at some point in tuning up this nib. We'll see. But maybe I haven't actually worked on it, but just looking at it, I would be looking to figure out if that's a problem. And I would also be looking to see if when this is properly adjusted, the very tip of it here, also at the top, looks very sharp. I believe I kind of felt it with my finger and it was kind of sharp. The user may not have a problem with that, but once you get it all lined up and adjusted properly, then, you know, you can kind of go back to the person and say, hey, like, what are you looking for in terms of experience? Because I feel like it's kind of feedbacky right now, but it's very sharp. Do you like a really sharp line? You know, do you want it smoother? There's different things you might have to sacrifice, but it's all possible. All right, another issue with this particular nib that I just want to talk about was alignment. So as opposed to flow, alignment could affect the flow, but it also affects the scratchiness. And so we have here, hold on. So we have here the same nib, and I've taken a picture of it. And that one, if you look at it like this, right? And I didn't do anything with this nib. This doesn't look that bad from this angle, right? Like everything looks in line. It looks nice and rounded. Not a lot, there's that point kind of at the bottom of the tipping, but it looks pretty good. But the truth is it's not aligned. And so one point to take is we got to look at it from all angles, right? Because now what I put up, same nib, didn't do anything to it, but you can see right over here, particularly right in this spot, there's like an overhang and it's misaligned. Like you can actually look at it right here. There's like, you see like a shadow. That's it being misaligned. I think I have another, you can show it even better. Just give me 1 second. Every time, there you go. So now you can see it from the top, right? There's an entire line that's it. And you can even see the bend. You got it better. So you see it there. That's the misalignment. You can see that it's a little sharp at the top of the nib and things like that. And then with this, you can actually, I could, in the naked eye, some of this is a little more obvious. So I was trying to capture as much as possible. You can also see that it like sort of goes, I'm doing this on a computer, but I'll try my best. You can see that it sort of goes out. Those are awful. Don't go back when I just tried to draw. That was awful. But basically along here and then right over here is it starts to bend. And so let's talk about what are the methods one does to deal with a nib like this. So first you got to decide, does it need to come off the feed or not? And this one might need to come off the feed. And the reason it might need to come off the feed is the nib is bent up, but it's also going to, because again, it's on a flat piece of paper, it's going to, and I don't know if it's better actually for me to stop the screen share at this point for this point. I'm doing it. So if you want to put me on speaker view so you can see this a little better. So it's not a flat piece of paper, right? It's curved. And when you have something like this, it's not up all around. Like look at my hands, right? Between my two index fingers, it's starting to flare out, right? So when you bend it, it's got to go on that angle. So you might need to take it off the feed. And what you would do is, first and foremost, you really need to look at like where that bend is, because you need to catch it where that bend is, lest you create another bend next to it, which then becomes extremely difficult to take out. So what you're trying to do is you're trying to gently press these things back into, to straight, but on that curvature. And so what typically happens is you press down one time below the other, and you press down the other time below the other, and that helps move it. But you gotta pay attention to what direction does this thing need to move. Because if you press straight down, there's a possibility you're gonna like bend it straight down, and it's not going to line up, and then it'll be more difficult to deal, or it's going to twist on you. So you got to make sure you're bending on that, whatever axis the bend is on. And so once you do that, then you check it out. If that looks good, then you put it back on the feed. Now, the thing you have to be concerned about with something like this is, as we saw, like the feed is here and the nib is bending away from it, right? So you got to think about how is that being fixed. Hopefully, once the tines come down, they'll be in proximity of the feed in the right way, and they'll be resting like they should on the feed. If not, you're going to have to go to a different methodology. One way to do it is what's called burnishing. So you might have seen a nib block, which is like it has channels and it has humps, so to speak, on an angle, and you rest the nib in the channels or on the humps. And then you use a polished metal object, which they sell burnishers like at art stores and craft stores and hobby shops and things like that. From X-Acto makes them, and or sometimes it comes with your nib block. I use a plastic one, which is like $25, very simple. It's made by Vintage Pens. David Nishimura makes them. The metal ones you can find are very expensive because like they're custom machined, and to get them nice and polished, I think it takes a lot of labor. So the plastic ones are a lot more economical. But you basically need to burnish and take out the bend and almost re-bend the nib back that way. So this method of pressing down the tines might do it, but for me, I would be checking to see, is that going to do it, or do I need to really use the nib block to really get this thing like a more holistic unbending? And that way you don't deal with more bends happening. You just have to be careful that the nibs are coming, the tines are coming back together in the right way, and you are not scratching it and things of that nature. And when you're done, it looks the right shape, and then it's going to sit on the feed properly. If it doesn't sit on the feed properly for some other reason, like it's more bent, you can investigate that. The other quick fix, which again, I'm not encouraging anyone just to do, but depending on what the scenario is, let's say the feed got bent in some way, there's a way to reset the feed like this. So if it's an injection molded feed, which this probably is, you are probably talking about having to boil hot water, submerge it for 30 to 45 seconds, and then like taking it out with pliers or tweezers or something, and then reseating it on it, which, obviously you're dealing with very hot objects, so be careful. I see some questions coming through. So let me guess, the front of nibs on. Krista has a question about ink in the front of the nib. I think sometimes it's a function of the nib. I think sometimes it's a function of the ink itself. Some nibs just do this because of how they're designed. And if they have little channels pressed into it that go to the nib slit, then you're going to have ink running different ways. I would say if you're going to wipe it off, you probably just need to take something you can manipulate so that you don't actually keep hitting the center of the slit, because that's going to keep dragging ink out if that is bothering you. As to the second question about how long it should stay wet and ready to write when uncapped. Again, the inks have different chemical compositions. Some inks are made to dry quicker. Some are made either deliberately or incidentally. They'll dry out. They'll take longer to dry out. Interestingly, about the point about cheaper pens, more reliable, what I would say is, so some of the problems I'm showing, the cheaper pens, because of how they're made, don't have them as much because I think, just the way the manufacturing goes, like a Lamy is a very well manufactured pen. When it comes to more expensive pens, the quality control on nibs may not be where the company is placing the resources. So, and that it's all company dependent. And so, unfortunately, there's no good answer to some of these questions. It's sort of, what is your intended use or your required use for these objects, and how well does a particular design and manufacturing match up to that? So, for example, you were talking about like the uncapping. Well, some pens, the caps are really well made, and they're going to stay wet in the cap for a very long time, and you'll uncap it and it'll write beautifully for many months at a time. For example, Platinum, you can get a $9.99 pen that will not dry out for like 3 or 4 months because of how it seals. Other pens are not made with that, and that's not where the company is putting the resources, or they don't have the know-how to do something like that. So if all you want to do is jot notes down with a pen that you can literally, like, if you drop it or it gets run over by a horde of people, and it gets smashed, you're not going to feel bad. That might be the perfect pen for you. In terms of keeping it uncapped, think about, unscrewing versus a slip cap or something, but there's no there's no consistent answer that I can give on some of this. It's more of a trial and error type thing.
Joshua, if you don't mind, sorry, that's my question.
Yeah.
I'm curious. So there are instances, for instance, where I'll use my Visconti Starry Night here,
Yeah.
and I'll take the cap off and I'll go ahead and I'll write something down and think for a second or two, and then I'll go to write something again and I'll have a hard start with it.
Yeah.
And so it's not a period, like a long duration at all. It's just something where, I'll be writing something in my notebook and, 30 seconds, 20 seconds, and it'll no longer want to write for me. And I'll have to kind of putz with it in order to get the ink flowing. Whereas I'll take my, $40 little guy here and I have no problem with this working for me at any point. So it's just, and I'm just wondering if it's the cheaper ink that I may have in my much nicer pen, or, something along those lines.
So I'm going to say something maybe fairly frustrating. Which is, no. But it's insightful, but the insight may be frustrating. So to the extent, I'm sorry, I'll apologize in advance. But what I would say is, one thing to consider is you're dealing with a number 5 nib versus a number 6 nib. That's a Pen BBS, right? The green one.
I don't know. What is this? The little Pilot?
Okay. Pilot. All right.
Is it a Pilot or a Sailor? What is this?
Oh, it's a Sailor. It might be a Sailor. Okay. So maybe it's a small nib. So one thing is to recognize, right?
Yeah.
Depending on what that feed is, the feed it plays a big role in it, right?
Okay.
So feeds are they can have different issues, but a big issue is just the space, like the actual surface space that's on a feed. So the one in your Visconti that might be like a number 5, it's a number 5 Bach feed. Might be very plain, like there's not a lot of ridges and not a lot of complications to it. It's just a very straightforward feed. And as a consequence, it doesn't have a lot of surface area to hold the ink as well as your other pen, whether it's a Sailor or Pilot. They're making a very complicated feed and I say complicated in just like the amount of fins and all that stuff. And so it can hold a lot more within the pen, and so it flows better.
Okay.
Number 5 nibs are notoriously difficult in terms of consistency because of the feeds are smaller. So it tends to be the number 6 nibs are more reliable, if for no other reason that the feeds tend to be more reliable. Okay. That's not always true. So if you have a company like Pilot, who are very well engineering their feeds, and they like to say that they're an ink company that made pens for the ink, right? So if that's their perspective, that it's pens for the ink and not ink for the pens, then they're doing something that's engineered very much for the use of ink. The Bach nibs are a standardized thing, and the manufacturers are selecting the sizes to meet their design. So, it's a different design approach that might be dictating it. And that's why there's so many little things dependent on some of this stuff. And then, if you have certain Waterman inks are considered much more lubricating than say like Rohrer Klinger, I think
right.
I was like considered, or Archimentis, like the German inks are somewhat drier, like the Mont Blanc Mystery Black, for example, somewhat dry ink. That's just the byproduct of their composition. So the things you can do with some of it, sometimes you can open up the feed channel, like on the Visconti, so it holds a little more when it stays prime. But yeah, these things, that's why I apologize for being a little bit complicated, because there's no one right answer. But it's sometimes why you can buy, like Pilot, Platinum, some of those pens, or Lamy, they're at their core, the selections are being made for usability, right? Sometimes that's not always the case with like a Visconti, because it's sometimes the aesthetics. How much time do we have, Ken? Because I want to be as efficient as possible with this.
No, we don't really have a set time.
Right, cool.
If it goes a little long or a little short, that's cool.
All right. So let me show. So I have another example. I'm just going to show what example of a pen where, again, it's not as obvious, but you start to pick up on this the more you do it. So this is a Marlin. And it looks pretty good, right? Like but the user's telling me, hey, I love this pen. It's a Marlin Basilea. I don't know if everyone's ever owned one or seen one. They're awesome looking, piston, the whole 9 yards. And it looks pretty good, right? Like you're like, why would it be skipping? Well, there's a couple reasons of things to pay attention to. So first of all, I may have a picture that shows it better, but for now, I'm just going to circle this area of the nib. And if you look really closely at it, and I might be able to actually make it big enough to see if I go slow. Sorry. Here we go. You can start to see that there's a little bit of a bend right over, hold on, my thing. As you can see, I'm obsessed with drawing on these pictures. Comes from being a trial lawyer. This is like we do this in federal court all the time because they have this great system. So right over here, it looks like it's narrowing, and down here by that ink blotch, it looks more consistent. But right in here, you can see that it's very slightly curved, right? Like there's a little bit of a curvature right there. And if you look at it, and I know I'm on an angle, but if you look at the other side, you see it's ever so slightly curved over there. So what is happening there? So that is interrupting the capillary action because the nib slip is widening and it actually is underneath. It's like bent upwards. So there's more space underneath than it should be. So the flow is inconsistent and that's what's happening. And so again, hold on, sorry. Every time I draw, then I lose the capability to switch. So I don't know if it's how obvious it is in this picture, but everything looks again pretty good. But you can see ever so slightly right below the level where the feed ends. Like if you were to continue down, you could see like it's a little bit raised, right? Like you could see that there's ink kind of like pooled up there, and it's actually closer at the very end of the feed than it is further out. And so that's what's giving the user the problem. I believe there's one other issue which I'll show, but here, this is, you actually see it, I think, probably the best in all of them. And again, not always easy to capture this in the naked eye. Wait, sorry, that's not what I intended to do. All right, so you can see it here that basically along this line right here, there's a bend. And that little bend, as small as it is causing some problems. So the first problem is the capillary flow is off. And then the other issue that I'm seeing is something we have not talked about. And so it's the flip side of baby's bottom, which is and you can actually, I think this is probably the best picture for all the problems, but let's start at the top. So the first thing is, look here at the very top of the nib, right? It is like sandwich closed, like there is no slit. The slit, you can see the shadow of it, but it is, the tines are basically touching. And so what's happening there is, and the reason that's happening, by the way, is because they're bent, the tines are bent down. And so they're pushing, again, it's not a flat piece of paper, right? So put it on the camera, right? So if you go out, right, it's going to bend out. But if you go down, at some point, they're going to start to push into each other. And you see that with twisted nibs. I have a couple of examples of that I'll show you before the end. But basically, because of that bend, lower in the space on the nib, you have, this is sandwiching shut. And I often think that this is the more common thing that happens as opposed to baby's bottom, is that it's actually something with the capillary action below, or it's more often than not, it's that the tines are touching. And the reason some manufacturers do that is because they look at old vintage nibs, and some of what happens in vintage nibs is the gold starts to actually push in itself over time, or they're flexible nibs, and so they're designed to kind of stay close together. So they think, oh, when I'm tuning this up and sending this to the store to be sold, I got to make sure my tines are touching, because that's what it is. And so this is like an older 90s model, I think, or maybe early 2000s, something like that. And so it might have been adjusted like that to begin with. The other thing that could have happened is someone flipped it over and wrote on it, and it pushed in the tines together, and that sort of created the bend. Because you can also see here, like you can kind of see, like right starting here, going down to, I'd say like here, you can kind of see that there's like a bigger space kind of on the right side, and that again is part of me taking the picture. But you can see that's a little off. And so I think that's the bend pushing the tines together. What would you do again? It's a matter of usually you start with your fingers. It might need to be burnished. You want to be careful with burnishing, especially because the white area on this nib is plated, and so the metal on metal will scratch off the finish. So you can cover it with tape if you have to go down there. You really shouldn't have to. But basically, the matter is to, it's a little bit tricky, right? Because you need to sort of unbend down, you have to unbend what's back and then get the front. So you got to work sort of from the bend in the space between the tines back up to the front. And that's how I would at least would do it. The other thing I just want to point out is something to pay attention to, and we'll talk about this in a second. If you look down here at the bottom of the nib slit, it's a little off. You're going to see that in a lot of nibs. Usually not a problem, but the question when you see if it's not a perfect slit into the breather hole is whether the tines themselves are going to be off. We'll talk about that in a moment. All right, so this marlin, so the takeaway from this marlin is you're having a bend that's forcing the tip together, so that's why it's skipping. The other thing is that you'll have that, but it's not necessarily because of a bend. You might get it out of a new pen from the box. Like particularly people complain like things from China write very dry. Sometimes the nibs are fine, but it's not excellent manufacturing, excellent quality control. And so as a consequence of that, you will need to open it up. If you have a touching tines without the nib, without a bend, what I do, which is not for everybody, is I actually take a spark plug tester, which is it's basically brass shims in different widths that are connected in like a little metal holder. And so I actually use that. Some people use X-Acto knives to push the tines apart. There's a way to press, like you press you put your finger over the breather hole and then you catch the sides of the tines, like down by where they flare out on the shoulders with your fingernails, and you push a little bit further and that'll open it up. I'm going to show you an example of a nib though, where that can go very wrong. So what you're trying to do is whatever object you're using to, some people call it flossing, you want to apply equal pressure, however you're doing it, to the inside of the tines, because you want to make sure you're hitting it below the tip, because what you want to make sure you're not doing is bending the tines outward by having pressure on the tip itself, right? So you want to, where that arrow is kind of in the middle, a couple inches below the tip there, that you want to get that with whatever object you're making space with, as opposed to higher up and where it's going to more likely bend out, and then you got to twist it back in. All right, moving right along. All right, this is again an example of something that is misaligned, but you can also see a hard edge. And if we were in a room together, I would ask, did anyone see where the hard edge is? But because we're not, the hard edge is actually on the inside of the tines. You can kind of see that they're a little squiggly. And so someone might get scratchiness from that because they're off. How that happens, I couldn't tell you exactly. I think it's a combination of how the nib is being polished by the manufacturer. And they basically, there was a burr there that kind of pushed into the other one. And so you want to, you sand that out by, again, sanding in between. I know I'm throwing out these methods, and I know I'm not really demoing any. Part of it is it's a little more involved to explain it, and my goal is to just try and show folks what's going on. Before I move on, though, let me see if there's any questions. All right, come back to that. All right. All right, so we got a question about a music nib, which, and we got a question about the smoothing the inside of the nib. So let's talk about those. So the music nib, is basically, if you're having flow issues with the music nib, it could be another problem, which I haven't talked about, which is, and I don't know what brand it is, but you might have a situation where the feed does not give that nib enough ink to really stay wet. You can open up the tines. I know that there was the question is specifically about making it a little wetter. Yes, you can do that. Okay, it's a Franklin Christoph. Okay, thank you. So the issue might be that, so what it may be that it probably is the tines need to be opened a little bit more. Sorry, just some things to try on some of my problem children. All right, first I was like, oh wait, kids are involved in this, but then I realized that you are talking about pens. Anyway, yeah. So what happens, right, is the you need a constant flow, right? Capillary action. The liquid has to keep moving. In a fat nib, you know, and sometimes you see this with like particularly like the Visconti like 1.1 stub, right? It's like a humongous tip. And so the whole thing needs to fill with ink. And so to keep up with you, you need to keep a lot flowing. So you might need to open up the space between the tines to keep it moving. At some point, though, you might have a problem with the flow of it from the feed. I don't think that's necessarily, I've not heard of that with the what's it called, with the Franklin Christoph nib. So it's probably a matter of just for your own preference, opening it up a little more if it can do. But that process, you know, it's sort of a trial and experiment, because if you open it up, but now the feed is not supplying that nib channel with ink, that sort of, you've reached the maximum capacity of what's up with that nib. You know, and then from there, you kind of like, well, what can we do? Can we give it a harder edge so it's not putting as much ink down at one point? So it's, you know, grinding it a little bit, because it's, you know, it's still got some surface, and taking that surface down to be something thinner might give you more lubrication. Narrowing it in some way, which then gets into a really crazy thing, narrowing a music nib with multiple tines, although it can be done. You know, so again, it has less surface area to have to fill as you go along. The question about how do you smooth the nib slit? So when you have a nib slit, you want to push open I'm actually going to draw on this. So if you're doing this, what you want to do is you want to push on the nib. Again, if you have, I have larger thumbnails for this, but if you have fingernails, it's very helpful. If you don't have fingernails, this can be much more difficult. But basically what you want to do is you want to push, you want to put pressure on the nib somewhere around here with a fingernail. And what that'll do is I'll open up the slit in the tine a little bit, but won't actually bend it out of shape, because that's, you don't want that to happen, of course. And then what you do is you take a piece of wet dry sandpaper. Again, I use 2000, other people use different stuff, but 2000 to me seems to take out the right amount of things, and that's how I was trained to do it. I know Richard Binder, he gives people that in his nib smoothing kit when he does the class. So what you do is you spread the tines a little bit to be able to get the paper in. And then what you do is you kind of like off, again, without avoiding bending it, you kind of like get the, you know, if this is the slit together, you kind of like push one side up a little bit, slide the paper in, and then polish the lower side. And then you reverse and you polish the lower side. So that what you do is you get an equal thing, but you do it very quickly. You don't linger there, because then you're going to get baby's bottom. You want to just like 1, 2, 3, flip, 1, 2, 3, because it's a very little burr, right? We're talking about something very small causing you a lot of problems, but you don't want to go too far. So then you test it and you see, did that take care of it? And that's how you would smooth out the inside of the tine. It can affect flow also. I mean, the tines being uneven or having this can affect flow, because again, you're talking about space filling with liquid, and if that's not happening properly, you will have an issue. All right, let me, if there's more questions on that, I'm happy to do that. I'm gonna jump ahead a little bit if you don't mind. Well, actually, I'll show one more photo with that. All right. So this is, you could see, this is very close together and totally off center or misaligned. So that's going to have a lot of problems. It might write too wet. It might write too dry. It might not write at all. It depends on if someone's pushing down every time and it's getting into line, but then like spreading out. So if something's off, like it's writing too broad and it's scratchy, you're probably dealing with misalignment. You know, if you have a fine nib and it feels like a broad and it's very scratchy, often that this is what's happening. It's because it's getting pushed open more than you want it to, so it's wetter. And that's a function of, again, the geometry and the physics being thrown off by this type of misalignment. This is, again, another example of a nib where the slit is touching, but it's touching in a way that I'll show you in a minute is maybe unexpected. So this is going to skip for that reason, right? But this nib has a double whammy, which is it's got a canyon. So it's the top of it is touching, but the bottom has baby's bottom because it's bent out. It's like it's bent or twisted. And so you can kind of see here that, you know, it's much wider on the bottom. This is a Yardeled nib, which I think is made by Joe. So there's a few things you can do for something like this. A quick and dirty fix, but again, you got to be very careful, is you squeeze from the back. So you would approach the nib from the metal side, right? So the top of it, you would squeeze the shoulders and give it pressure to bend it in, and that might take this and go like that. If that's not working, you might have to use some sort of specialty plier that can fit in there and actually twist it. That is very advanced stuff that I would not attempt unless it's a nib you don't care about and want to see if you can do it, or you're feeling up to the challenge. But this is probably one of the most annoying things to deal with in the world of nibs, especially on a gold nib, because gold has memory and does not want to unbend from its current state very easily, even if it's wrong. So you sometimes need more force. Like I'm probably more gentle than I need to be at times, but I'm more cautious because I don't want to, you know, damage, you know, some very nice pen that someone has. Other folks with great skill could do like, you know, give it more force and are very successful. For me, it takes a little more. And I think that's most people's experience. So you know, you want to really be judicious in how you're doing it to kind of see the baby's bottom in that a little more. All right, let's talk about a disaster nib. So this could be a really cool nib. It's a Parker Lucky Curve in like the junior size. And you're gonna see it's really messed up. And well, that's the next one. So let's talk about this one for a little bit. So this one has everything wrong with it you could possibly imagine. The tines are misaligned. They're bent, and they're bent in a way that there's a space between the feed down in the slit, but then they're touching up top, and you could see they're misaligned, and you know, obviously needs a cleaning, but and then the tipping is different size from H. So what do you do with something like this? Well, you follow the same things, and so you start with the unbending and what do you need to unbend and when. So I probably would say with something like this, you don't want to necessarily start at the top. You kind of want to start in the middle and get it sort of better there, but then go to the bottom of where the slit is and see if it's bent like in line with where the breather hole is, because that's probably giving you some of that like flare out. So it's like this. So you want to adjust this, then you want to bring it down or something like that. And then, but the big thing that I want everyone to be aware of with something like this is there's a difference between the metal being deteriorating and it just being dirty. But what will sometimes say to me, you got to be really careful. And I'm going to try and zoom in on this. If you look at this, right, you can kind of see there's like striations in the metal, like it might be deteriorating. See if we can get a better view of that. Like you can kind of see it like by the feed, there's lines. So I don't know if those are scratches or that's the metal itself starting to deteriorate, which happens. You can see that like it looks pretty stable. Like there's no cracks or anything. So you want to just be careful because it might be much more brittle because of age and things like that. And it might be much more likely to snap on you when you're trying to bend it and unbend it. All right, the next one is, this is a Moore. So also a vintage nib. You want to be careful about the metal, because you can see that it is a little striated. And again, that's not to say if it's striated, you shouldn't touch it. I fix nibs that are striated, but you just want to be cautious based on like what the gold is doing. It may be just surface dirt or, grit or something made scratches in the material that are very fine, or it is that the metal is deteriorating. So if it's something that matters to you and you're worried about it, consult, think about it, whether you're going to really try and fix it, or if the nib snaps and you lose the tipping for some reason, can it be replaced? Like you might be able to get a lucky curve nib very easily, or you have spares of it, and so you feel more comfortable. Couple of things with this nib. So this is another vintage nib, and so you might see from time to time a nib that's bent, one tine is bent in on the other. What you do with something like this is I'm going to go for my handy dandy arrow. Excuse me for 1 second. All right. What you do is you actually have to use one tine against the other. So basically what you do is you use like needle nose pliers. You have one side of the needle nose pliers put against the upper part of the tine that's bent out. And then you probably need to canter the pressure down here, right? Because that's where the bend is. And so then you twist a little bit, ever so gently, and then that will actually unbend the tine that's on the right by using the pressure from the left. And so they'll both hopefully get back in line. And then what you need to do is make sure that the tines are even. And that is sort of this one you could see, like even with it bent, like it looks pretty good. Because that will tell you if you still have a bend, right? Because if it's still, like if it's still a little bit lower, you might have a bend, so you want to push it out, so that's a good way to know how far you're getting. The last thing to pay attention to, obviously, is that because of age, there is a hard edge. I don't know if you can see it, but it's right over here, sort of right here. It will remain scratchy, and you do this sort of the same thing I talked about with like the curvature type sanding, and then you go to the edges to fix that. All right, last thing I just want to talk about, because this also affects flow and scratchiness, is the evenness of the tipping. So this is actually an Estabrook nib. I ground this to a scribe nib, which I do for them the other day. This one had wonky tipping. I think this is it. And you could see that like it one side is just thicker than the other. And again, think of the geometry, right? To cover this whole thing in ink, one side's going to need more than the other. So that's going to be an issue. The other thing that might happen is if the and so you see this is another view of it. It's slight, but it might be scratchy because one side is bigger, and as you move the pen, that tipping is pushing the tines in different directions almost. What you need to do is sand one side down, or grind it in some way that eliminates that problem, and that might. So the last time I really saw that was actually with a modern Parker, like a Parker Urban or something like that. It was crazy, like how big it is. But you see it in nibs, like the slit is a little off, and then it causes some problems, which I was talking about earlier. And this is another one. It's a Bach nib on like a more modern pen. Again, this is another issue that it looks okay, but actually the tines are spread up top. And then I think you can see that's a little bent on there. This is, I've been trying to burnish this one, but it's stubborn, so it's taking time. All right, let me stop the share. And so that's the pictorial part of this. Let me see what kind of questions. So good question from Dave. How do you polish the nib after sanding with a 2000 grit paper? I use 1200 micro mesh, 1200 grit, no, 12,000 grit micro mesh. So it's very fine. And I know Richard talks about lapping film in terms of using the white lapping film to take off microscopic little pieces of metal. For some reason, I don't have that problem, but I know people do. So if you can get a hold of his notes, which I think are available online, he kind of explains the abrasives in more detail. What I would not do is the paper bag trick, because the paper bag trick, although it works, the one drawback, and again, this is a matter of personal judgment, I guess, but the paper bag is not a consistent grit. Micro mesh, the sandpaper, you know, they're manufactured so that the grit is consistent, you know, so you don't get new and interesting like scuffs and stuff in the nib if you do that, as opposed to the paper bag or the penny. I don't know. I've heard the penny. I don't understand the penny, but that's me. I'm so into how I do it that I can't even fathom it. So. You know, I know people do it and it's worked. To me, you want precision with something like this, especially the nicer the nib is. Like if you have a, you know, like 60s or 70s Mont Blanc 149 nib, I don't know how much a paper bag is a wise decision. All right, and Marianne, I guess, has a good question. How do you reduce feedback? So feedback is really interesting because again, it can be a number of different things. So the first thing is to see if you have a hard edge somewhere. It could be anywhere, because again, like your mind, you don't intuitively think you're hitting it, but it's like it could be somewhere on the underside, the top, the corner, somewhere like that. And if you don't mind getting a little ink on your fingers, you can actually just kind of feel around with your finger and see, is there somewhere that it's scratchy? You can also pay attention to, when you're writing, is there one particular direction I'm going in, or one particular character I'm making that is got the scratchiness, and then figure out why is that happening, either by looking at a loop or something like that, or feeling it, or both. You should probably do both. And then you tackle it by just trying to smooth out that edge, whatever it is. And there's different ways to do it depending on what it is. Sometimes it's the alignment is ever so off, so it's feedbacky because it's a very, very minuscule. And again, you'll feel it though, right? Because if the paper's it's showing up in the contact with the paper, you probably can feel it with your finger. So you can just swipe your finger underneath and see if it's that. If you're not able to see it under magnification, the last thing just that that sometimes comes to mind is that sometimes the nibs are just over polished. They're over polished to the point it's like a mirror, and that's a problem too, right? Because the liquid needs to adhere to the front of the nib as you're writing. So if it's too smooth, like too polished, it's going to be like a mirror, and the ink doesn't stay under it, and so it's just your pen scraping on the paper. Although it's smooth, it's like if you were to think about, like if you dragged your fist over like a mirror, like what that would feel like. You know, that's happening. There's no lubrication. So sometimes that's the feedback. And then sometimes it's the paper. So if you try different papers, you know, it may give you some indication. Is it just a grainier paper versus a smoother paper or coated paper? Figure eights. Yes, good question on the figure eights. Yeah, so the issue with the figure eights, right, is that it's a repeated movement. And whenever you're doing a repeated movement against an abrasive, you are potentially creating an edge or like a shape in it because it's one way around. And so you want to keep it from all angles, however you're doing it. I don't know because we say figure eights, right? It's literally like tracing the figure eight. I know that some people, like, you know, they'll turn it in different ways, and that's it. The writing though of figure eight might be okay. So I don't know exactly what it's seeing, but if it's working for you and you're not, what I'll say is if it's working for you and it's not causing a problem, you know, fine. I mean, that's, part of this is like, no one needs to become like a nib meister extraordinaire. If you can solve the problem in a way that works for you and you're comfortable, then there is like nothing necessarily wrong with that. I can just say that, if you get a hard edge, it might be the result of a repeated movement in a particular way on a abrasive. If you're not getting a hard edge, then you might be using something that's softer or something like that, and it works out. So that's why the people caution folks against figure eights. Is just because if you do it enough, it might cause more problems. Any other questions or anything? I know we've reached the noon hour, and I know I've talked a lot. I thank you all for listening to me. I hope it's been helpful. But I'm happy to answer a couple more questions if folks have them.
Yeah, Dave's got one in chat. Have you ever tried diamond paste for smoothing?
No, I have not. Again, the thing that's good about the paper and the micro mesh, right, is that it's fixed, and so a lot more control. I feel like diamond paste, you need very fine applicators, and but if you have a nib, if you have a Jinhao nib or something that costs 99 cents and you want to try it, there's nothing that said don't try it. I mean, a lot of this nib techniques are people trying and finding what seemed to work best or what does work best, so if you have a problem and you want to see if diamond paste will do it, I mean, theoretically some of these abrasives and tools are impregnated with diamond dust. They are with an abrasive. So why theoretically, if you impregnate what's it called, like a swab with diamond stuff, and you applied it to one place and it buffed out whatever it was you were looking to buff out, and it worked for you, okay. I mean, I don't necessarily see anything wrong with that, other than you just got to be careful, again, causing stress edges from a repeated movement or something like that. But it's if you have the opportunity is there to try it, I mean, you could try it and see what happens. The caution always is, don't, even if it worked for you, it's not necessarily going to work for other people. So I always try to be cautious with advice, like if like I give you all these warnings and I'm like, I don't know, it's not something to try, just if it worked for you, you should be very specific about how it worked so that people understand, because people will go trying stuff and then come back and say, well, what the heck, that was not great. So what's my strategy for working on nibs when people have different preferences on how they want their pen to write? So I try and talk to people about a couple different things, right? So what are you doing with it? What do you like about the pens you do like? What don't you like about the pens you don't like? The biggest two things I see with preferences are people who are into fines are really into fines. And so it's just a question of how fine. And I find that people who are into fine do like it really fine. They're like, don't make it too fine. And I'm like, I bet you like it really fine. So sometimes I think that people who are into fines really appreciate a really nice fine line. And the other big one is there's people who like calligraphy, but they don't like super broad nibs. And so they like a nice sharp edge. I find that that's a frequent characteristic, is that you might like big writing, but you want a very controlled big writing. Like I like the big, wet, markery nibs, but I'm not a calligrapher. There's a lot of people who love like that nice, clean, sharp line, but then a nice thick line. And that tends to be a lot of people's preferences for broad nibs. Any other questions? I'm getting summoned to the other room. Thank you, everyone. This has been really exciting. I hope to be at a St. Louis pen show at some point in the future. My wife's father grew up in Potosi, which is, I think, about an hour and 10 minutes south, right? Or west, southwest, something like that. Anyway, so I have very fond memories of visiting St. Louis and Kansas City and all this stuff. So hope to see everyone in person before you know it. All right. Thank you so much. Thank you, Ken.
Sure thing. Thanks, Joshua. We really appreciate you coming and spending time with us and sharing your craft and your your knowledge. So thank you very
My
much.
pleasure.
And thanks everybody for attending. We'll hopefully see everybody in about 40 minutes for the next session on doodling and tangles.
Nice. All right.
All right. Thank you.
All right. Bye.